Hello sewists! Today's sewing session is going to be talking about travertine. Travertine is our sewing pattern for the month of June 2024, and it's a combo of patterns. It's a tank top, it's a skirt, and it's a dress. In particular today I'm going to give you some tips and tricks on pattern alterations and how to wear a narrow racerback, and we're going to go through the installation of the binding, how to bind the edges of the armholes and the neckline. Okay, so here's travertine. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some alterations. We're going to see this is drafted as a narrow shoulder top. If you want to make it more racerback, you are going to want to reduce the sides of the shoulders and also to make this seam more curved towards the inside. And one tip I have is that you can wear your regular bras with this top. If you have a little piece of knit fabric, a little strip, you can tie the bra straps in the back and it's gonna do wonders. That's how I wear my bras with racerbacks, and it's really great. So to do this alteration for a more racerback, we need a ruler, our markers, and our pattern pieces. So say I want my racerback to be half an inch narrower. Mark half an inch in, making sure this is coming out at a 90-degree angle. I'm gonna also mark half an inch here so that when I am done with the alteration, these two parts match, also coming at a 90-degree angle. And I'm gonna blend, I would say, to this notch and to this notch, okay? So I take my curve, and for the front, this pattern has 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So at the 3/8 of an inch from the square line that I started, I'm gonna bring it down to my notch, like that. So this will be my new cutting line. And we're gonna do the same for the back. As I said, starting here with my 90 degrees perpendicular line to my shoulder. And I'm gonna do the same to blend it in with my notch. So this is narrowing the shoulders. We can trace this line here and cut this new shoulder line for narrower shoulder. But if you want, you could also make it narrower through the back. So to do that, all we have to do is kind of bring the curve further in and then blend it lower towards the shoulder. You can also bring the neckline in if you want, just bring it higher. Always remember that when you are adjusting the piece at the center front, the line that comes into the center front has to be perpendicular to the center front. And when you are adjusting at the shoulders, the new lines have to come out at a 90-degree at the shoulders, so that when we put these two seams together, it's gonna be a smooth transition. So always remember that when you do an alteration to a curve, if this is the alteration that you made, just a narrower shoulder, you don't have to adjust the armhole binding. But if you do a more drastic alteration like this armhole bind, like this racerback curve, this did change the length of the original curve quite significantly. Probably, let's say, about 1 inch longer. If this new curve is about 1 inch longer, then what I need to do is add 80% of the increment to the armhole binding. So instead of adding, if I added 1 inch in length here, I will add 0.8 of an inch to the armhole binding. That will keep it like pulling in snugly, and it will fit in the armhole. So in the case of travertine, we have drafted a supportive lining. And let's talk a little bit about compression. We were doing an experiment with this one, and we decided to use power mesh. But if you use power mesh, because this is drafted for knits, knit had less recovery than power mesh. So you will find that power mesh is quite compressive. You don't want to feel like a sausage. So if you are using the supportive lining, I would recommend, if you're using power mesh, increasing the side seams so that you have a little bit more room. And if you are willing to use some other fabric, then use a thinner mesh or even self fabric. In these Monse materials, we have also included a blog post that shows you how to add foam cups to your supportive lining. Just head over to the resources for this month and you will find it there. The binding for travertine is drafted with a 5/8 of an inch width. We're gonna see how we can do that, and we're gonna check how we can have a wider binding. So this is the plan. We have cut our back and front of the top. We're gonna assemble it at the shoulders, and then I have cut 2 of our armhole bindings. We're gonna see if there is a difference between attaching an armhole binding without this knit stay tape and with attaching this binding by stabilizing the armhole before with this knit stay tape. And then for the neck binding, I cut it slightly wider, 3 1/4 inches, because I want to experiment with doing that wide binding. The way we install this binding is it turns 3 times over the edge that we're binding. So by putting 3 inches, we have a 1/4 of an inch extra so that we can turn it and then attach it, and if we have an excess, we cut it. Okay, so this is the neck binding cut with a width of 3 1/4 inches. I prepared the sample so that we can sew the bindings. In this case, we're going to have the fusible knit tape both in the front and in the back of this armhole. We're going to have no knit tape here, and we're going to do the wide binding in the neckline. I just went in and applied the binding first to one side of the armhole, making sure that it's the same side in the front and in the back. Applied it to the wrong side of the fabric, and then I sewed my shoulder seams and my side seams. Let's start applying the binding to the side that has the stay tape interfacing. We are going to turn this inside out because we want to attach the binding from the right side. To do that, we first have to find the 1/4 points of the armhole. So I'm going to measure from the shoulder. I'm going to line both armholes, like both the front and the back of the armhole, following the edge. And I'm going to put a notch here. This is the midpoint between the shoulder and the underarm. Okay, now I'm going to align that notch with the shoulder seam to find the 1/4 points. So there it is. We follow the edge. We align the edges because we're binding the edge. So we want the middle point of the edge. We're going to notch there. And then we're going to find the other 1/4 point on this side. So now that we have the 1/4 points matched, I'm going to do the same for my binding. So I've gone ahead and sewed the narrow seam in my binding, and now I have to find the 1/4 notches. We already find them in the arm side, so now I hold my binding from the side we sewed, and I'm going to find the midpoint and do a tiny notch. Be careful. We have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. This is why we can do this, but the notches I'm doing are actually just like 1/8 of an inch deep. Okay, don't go crazy here. Then I align my midpoint notch with my seam, and I need to find my quarter points. So there goes one, the same on the other side, and the same on the opposite side. Okay. Okay, so I would say we align this binding with the bottom notch. I align my binding with the seam in my binding with the underarm notch. I'm going to put one pin there on both sides. I'm going to fold the binding towards one side. Then I'm going to align my other quarter notch with my first quarter notch. My other quarter notch is up at the shoulder. And I like to make sure that my shoulder seam is pointing towards the back. So I'm going to fold my seam towards the back, and then I'm going to put my pin there. Now the final one at the back. Now that my binding is attached, you can see it's slightly shorter than my edge. So I'm going to ease it when I apply it. When I sew it, I'm going to go ahead and sew at 5/8 of an inch with a narrow zigzag, making sure that I account for that stitch width as I'm sewing. For this, I like to remove the base, like that. And I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch this seam. So I'm going to line it at 1/2 an inch here. And this will account for the width of that zigzag stitch. Back stitch at the beginning. Back stitch, cut your thread. Let's look at this. So we sew the first pass of our binding, and always it's useful when you apply a little bit of heat to allow that seam to relax. But you see, using that seam tape keeps this very stable and helps it not to ruffle and do other things that sometimes you have, some other issues that you have when you're sewing knits. Judith really likes it. Okay, and here's a trick. I'm gonna come in and make a little snip just in the seam allowance of the binding so that I can turn it to the opposite direction. Just a little bit. This will help it turn it, and this will reduce the bulk on the seam of the binding. So we're going to turn it up, and then we're going to turn it around. And so this makes 1 layer of binding, 2 layers of binding, and 3 layers of binding. We're going to come over here and with a twin needle secure the seam of the binding. Here we are. I have my binding folded, and I'm going to start here at the side seam. I threaded my double needle, so I have a red thread coming from one needle, a yellow thread coming from the other needle, and a blue thread coming from the bottom. I have this presser foot because I like to use this lever of the presser foot to align with my binding edge. So what I'm going to do is come down and keep the fold of the binding aligned with this edge. And that way, my stitches are going to be always at the same distance from the fold. And I'm going to kind of like just gently tense the binding over the edge and make sure this is not folding in any way. and let's try. Okay. Back stitch a little bit. Okay, let's move on. Take your time, there's no point in going fast here. And here at the end you can back stitch or pull the threads to the back and make a knot. So here we are. It's looking pretty cool. Let's now take a look at it. You can see both rows of stitches on this side, and in the back you can see the zigzag stitch. Right now we're just gonna remove this excess of binding using our duckbill scissors. The way I like to do this is take my fabric this way and start cutting. This blade that is extended will protect from cutting this side of the binding. So, like that. Here we go. We can always use the ham to press this again, especially if you are seeing like there is a little bit of stretch. If you usually have stretch, that means that you should reduce your tension in your needle or you press it for pressure. We have a blog post with tips on how to use double needles, so go check that one out. And now I'm gonna go do this side with the binding, and this side has no need stabilizer tape. And remember that I have my binding, I need to mark my quarters here, and I need to mark my quarters in the binding, and then I'll align the quarters and go on to the machine and sew. Here is my binding attached to the other arm side after the first pass, and you can see that it's slightly more wavy, so what we're gonna do is press it into submission. And you can see that that is gonna make a lot of difference. It's not the only or the main solution, but in this case, because it is so little, that is gonna have a good impact. And remember here now, I'm gonna clip the binding slightly so that I can turn the seam allowance to the other side. I'm gonna trim my thread and then turn the binding over to the other side and go do my second pass of stitches with my twin needle. I'll be back. This is how it looks like. It's looking pretty good, I have to say. I don't think for this fabric, having the knit interfacing makes a big difference. Where we notice is making a big difference is for fabrics that are very, very slinky, very hard to work with. This is something that you can use if you are having issues with your stitches. I haven't even pressed this side. I'm gonna go ahead and press it, but you can see that you don't always need to use that stabilizer. It's kind of a nice to have, especially if you often find like it is causing, if you're having issues, but I think it looks pretty good. Now, let's attempt that 1-inch binding here where we have a lot of curve in the neckline. So for that, as I said before, I cut my binding slightly wider at 3¼ inches. My binding is at quarters, my neckline is at quarters. I'm gonna go ahead and pin this just like I did before. What I wanna do is do one first pass of stitches at 5/8 of an inch, make the binding kind of stable, and then do another pass at 1 inch. This is my trick for you. So let's go ahead and do that. First, at 5/8 of an inch, the same way I was doing before. This is actually aligned at 1/2 an inch, back stitch, back stitch, and then let's do the second row of stitches. So right now we have this one anchored here. We're gonna sew at 1 inch, and I want to leave 1/8 of an inch so that I can adjust for the width of the stitching. So I'm just gonna try to align my stitches, the edge of my fabric at 1/8 of an inch from the 1 inch marking. Okay, let's go. Back stitch, then forward. Back stitch. Okay. We have done the 2 passes of stitches, one at 5/8 and one at 1 inch. We're gonna go ahead as before and press. If you were using the stabilizer tape and you want to do the 1 inch binding, I would recommend that you press the binding around the armhole on the neckline or the neckline as we did before, and then you add another line of binding around. I think that would make sure that you're stabilizing properly the edge. But in this case, we're trying it without the binding, so I'm just going to go ahead and steam this. Okay, this is looking good on this side. Good. And now, as before, I'm going to clip on the seam allowance of the binding and turn it this way and then double fold it. Now, there's one thing I have to tell you about before. If your fabric doesn't have enough stretch, I would recommend using ribbing. Okay, that's the little note I wanted to add there. Now we're gonna fold the binding over to the back and under. And as you can see, if we did this correctly, the first row, the higher row of stitches helps stabilize the edge over which the binding folds. And we had to add 1/4 of an inch, and that was to accommodate for the turn of the cloth here, and then a little bit extra so that we can catch the binding on the other side. So I'm now at the machine. As before, I'm gonna align the fold of the binding with the lever edge of the presser foot, and then start stitching. I didn't change my stitch. Remember to do a straight stitch and adjust your length and your tension. Softly folding the binding over the edge and making it flat underneath. Back stitch. Let's take a look. Okay, this is how it looks like. I just need to trim the excess of the binding, and we're gonna press this a little bit. But I think it's looking pretty cool. And as you can see, we didn't really need to add some stabilizer tape. It might have helped with a little bit of this gaping, but overall, I think it looks really nice. So that's it for the application of the binding in the neckline and the arm size for Travertine. And I hope my tips are useful to you. If you do end up making it and adding this extra wide binding, then remember to share it on social media with the hashtag ClosetCoreTravertine. See you in the next one.